On this Sunday night, touching tributes.
It was a call to duty for her.
As one of Canada's longest-serving mayors,
I love to work.
Hazel McCallion has died. Plus, culture change, how the Tyre Nichols case is reviving calls for reform in police response across the U.S. Global News digs into the problems pouring into aging Canadian naval vessels. And chiseled to perfection.
We probably have 30,000 pounds of ice here in town.
The competing carvers bringing warmth with their ice-cold creations.
Global National with Farah Nasser. Reporting tonight, Nitu Garcha.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. We begin tonight with the tributes pouring in for Hazel McCallion. The former mayor of Mississauga, known by many as Hurricane Hazel, led the city for 12 terms. A trailblazer for women in politics and a mentor to politicians, she touched the lives of millions in her 101 years of living life to its fullest.
She was amazing, and I went to so many events with Hazel, and make no mistake about it, she was the star of the show, no matter who she was with.
Ontario Premier Doug Ford was one of many to pay his respects today, recalling their long personal and professional relationship, including one last memento he got from her, a signed Formula One with Hazel steering the wheel. As Touria Izri reports, many agree her leadership will be her legacy.
Hurricane Hazel was a force, with her dominating personality and political invincibility.
A woman can do anything a man can do.
That was not the prevailing view when McCallion took office. She ran for mayor in 1978 as the underdog. The incumbent referred to her as a woman wanting to get into a man's world.
Ladies and gentlemen, the people of Mississauga have spoken tonight.
She got in and stayed in for the next 36 years.
She did it. And we knew that if Hazel McCallion could do it, we could do it too. So she was an inspiration for many of us in business and in politics.
McCallion was an inspiration to generations of politicians, transforming a collection of quiet townships into a major metropolis.
She built the city of Mississauga. Mississauga is what it is today because of Mayor Hazel McCallion.
She was born on a farm in Quebec in 1921 and moved to Toronto to work with engineering firm Canadian Kellogg during the Second World War, before eventually making Mississauga home. As mayor, she faced a major leadership test early on.
The flames were just incredible.
A CP train carrying hazardous chemicals derailed and exploded. No one died in the disaster, and McCallion was credited for her swift response. She was known for her common touch and straight-talking style.
A person without a job is not interested in balancing the budget.
And became a fixture in municipal politics.
Not only was she one of the most lovable people in her own way, but she was tough as nails.
So tough, McCallion outlasted 7 premiers and 8 prime ministers.
Hazel McCallion was a remarkable and inspiring leader, an extraordinary woman, and a really good friend.
In her long career, there were also low points. McCallion was accused of failing to disclose a conflict of interest involving her son, in a case that was ultimately dismissed. Her biographer believes she will be remembered most as a political pragmatist.
She had this remarkable ability, better than any politician I've known or studied, to feel the public pulse, to kind of sense the public mood.
And living actively to 101, she was also a symbol for healthy aging.
This idea about age, I just don't buy it.
A hurricane who left her mark in Mississauga and across the country. Touria Izri, Global News, Ottawa.
To the U.S. now, where there are widespread calls for Congress to reform policing across the country over the death of 29-year-old Tyre Nichols, who was severely beaten by police in Tennessee. 5 now former officers have been charged with second-degree murder in Nichols' death. The special unit they were a part of has also been disbanded. But as Jennifer Johnson reports, Republicans are already pushing back on the calls for national change.
Get on the ground! After the police body cam video of the brutal beating of Tyre Nichols went public, calls are growing louder for Congress to take action. Finally passed the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act to improve police training and ban certain potentially deadly practices.
Shame on us if we don't use his tragic death to finally get the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act passed.
Federal lawmakers haven't passed sweeping policing reform in decades, even as violent deaths at the hands of law enforcement shock the world. But top Republicans in the House are taking the same route they have on gun control, that nothing can be done.
No amount of training is going to change what we saw in that video. These individuals, these 5 individuals, did not have any respect for life.
Protesters who have taken to the streets across the country feel differently.
I feel like that we have to stand up for injustice and we have to have police reform. This cannot keep happening.
Memphis's police chief has decided to disband the department's so-called Scorpion unit, which was designed to crack down on street crime, a move many city residents applauded. All 5 former officers were part of that group.
There have been scattered reports of abuses by the Scorpion unit, and then nationally, some of these quick swarm suppression specialty units sometimes can lead to over-aggressive tactics.
Unlike what happened to George Floyd in Minnesota, the 5 former officers in this case were all black. Experts say while America's city police forces are getting more diversified, greater changes have to be made.
Simply diversifying sworn officer rosters is insufficient if there is not structural change to make things fairer and more just.
U.S. President Joe Biden has called on Congress to pass the George Floyd Act, but it failed after Floyd's shocking death, and many believe it will fail again. Jennifer Johnson, Global News, Washington.
Today marks the 6th anniversary of the shooting inside a Quebec City mosque. A ceremony took place this evening inside the very mosque prayer room where the rampage happened. This, along with other events across the province commemorating the tragedy, with survivors and supporters gathering in solidarity. A lone gunman walked into the place of worship in 2017, killing 6 worshippers and wounding several others. The gunman, who pled guilty, was sentenced to life in prison, although a Supreme Court ruling allows him to apply for parole after 25 years. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says Israel will respond to attacks against its citizens with an iron fist, but that he's not seeking an escalation. Cabinet approved several reforms in response to the shooting deaths of 7 Israelis outside a synagogue on Friday, one of which include making it easier for Israelis to obtain permits to carry guns, a move Netanyahu says will reduce gun violence. It's been a year of increasing tensions between Israel and Palestine, with an unprecedented number of Palestinian civilians and militants being killed. Netanyahu has also been brought back to lead the most right-wing government in the country's history. The UN and U.S. have condemned the rise in fatal attacks, with Antony Blinken's upcoming trip to Jerusalem this week set to focus on efforts to ease tensions. This eyewitness video reportedly shows the moment a drone strike hit a military factory in Iran. There are no reports of injuries, and the Defense Ministry says it was able to shoot down other drones targeting the site. The unclaimed attack is being referred to by the foreign minister as an attempt to create instability in the country. Violent clashes with riot police in Lima left at least 1 protester dead as weeks of anti-government demonstrations continue in Peru. Police used tear gas to disperse people in the latest round of demonstrations, which have been ongoing since early December. After weeks of demonstrations in rural regions, protesters have descended on the Peruvian capital as they call for the current president to step down and demand fresh elections. More than 50 deaths have now been connected to the protests, according to human rights activists. To Halifax now, where there's renewed concern over aging Canadian naval vessels. The Royal Canadian Navy suggests a parts failure causing flooding on board HMCS Summerside on January 20th was minor. But the alarming incident was only revealed after Global News began asking questions. And as Ross Lord reports, military analysts say taxpayers should expect more of these problems as Navy ships are stretched beyond their original purpose and life expectancy.
Sometimes trouble happens when you least expect it. That's the case with the Navy's HMCS Summerside. The ship spent 4 months in the Baltic Sea and the North Atlantic opposing Russian aggression without reporting any notable incidents. Then, as Summerside was tied up at the Halifax Naval Dockyard last Friday, there was cause for concern. A Global News source, whose information has been confirmed by the Navy, says the ship began taking on water and started listing. In a statement, Commanding Officer Richard Crowder says water flooded down into several compartments, including some cabins, the wardroom, and the machinery control room. Crowder says the likely source of the leak was a pipe fitting that failed. He says the valve failure has been initially assessed as being due to corrosion. And that's where much of the concern lies.
It's a valve failure on a 25-year-old ship. And that ship was only meant to last 25 years. So things like that are characteristic of old ships.
The Summerside is the youngest of 12 coastal defense vessels that retired Navy Commander Ken Hansen notes are increasingly being used to fill in for larger Canadian patrol frigates when the military's reach exceeds its grasp. The 12 frigates are even older, and they've been doing double duty since the Navy's fleet of destroyers was retired several years ago. The good news? The leak was detected and stopped before slight listing turned into something worse.
This was manageable with good leadership and good teams and good procedures.
The Navy says there's no damage to mechanical or electrical systems, but with corrosion and other problems more common after ships go beyond their life expectancy, military analysts say more trouble is inevitable. Ross Lord, Global News, Halifax.
Coming up, the Avalanche season's deadly start.
The mountains are beautiful, but particularly perilous. I'm Heather Urix West near Canmore, Alberta. I'll have more on why this avalanche season is off to such a deadly start ahead.
A warning for backcountry enthusiasts in Alberta and BC. The risk of deadly avalanches is at a 20-year high. A stretch of cold and dry weather back in November means the snowpack is unstable throughout the region. As Heather Urix West explains, in the last few weeks alone, snowslides have already killed 5 people.
For David Stark, there are few sounds more terrifying than the crash of an avalanche.
It's so distinct. And it's loud, it's thunderous. Sometimes it's a crack. Depends on the size and the magnitude of the avalanche, but it's a fearsome sound.
It's why Stark's team works to train 800 backcountry users every year on avalanche safety. But this year he worries safety training may not be enough.
We're all quite worried about it. We're all paying attention to what's happening with the avalanche conditions, and we're being really careful.
That's because the snow blanketing much of the mountains in BC and Alberta is sitting precariously on a very unstable layer formed by a stretch of cold and dry weather last November.
This type of instability or this type of weakness doesn't go away in a hurry, and so we expect it to be here for the long term.
Snowpack conditions are so unstable that this winter is being compared to 2003. That avalanche season claimed 29 lives.
This year's avalanche season has so far killed 5, including Constable Wade Tiddamore and Constable Mathieu Nollet, 2 off-duty police officers who died after a slide on January 9th near Caslow, BC. A third person, a snowmobiler, was killed after an avalanche in Valemont on January 21st. Then 2 days later, American brothers Jonathan and Timothy Kinsley died after being buried while heliskiing near Revelstoke, BC.
The best strategy for managing an avalanche problem like this, managing a deep persistent slab problem, is avoidance. So avoiding high consequence slopes, avoiding steep terrain.
Get the training, have a process when you go out. So pay attention to what Avalanche Canada says, read the bulletins, and then dial back on the terrain.
Because in a season with so much risk, the best way to keep backcountry users safe is to keep everyone out of harm's way. Heather Urix West, Global News, near Canmore, Alberta.
4 people are confirmed to have died after extensive flooding in New Zealand. Auckland, New Zealand's largest city, has been battered by rain since Friday and remains under a state of emergency. In just 15 hours, the city was hit with 75% of its seasonal rainfall. The country's climate science body says global heating is causing these types of weather events to become increasingly common and intense. The severe weather is expected to continue into Monday. Ahead, Novak Djokovic adds to his legendary career by coming out on top down under. Novak Djokovic has done it again at the Australian Open, winning the final in straight sets to claim a record-extending 10th title. The Serbian tennis star was dominant throughout the tournament, dropping just 1 set across 7 matches, despite playing through a nagging hamstring injury. Djokovic is now tied with Rafael Nadal with 22 Grand Slam championships, the most by any male tennis player, and has not lost at Melbourne Park since 2018. Back here in Canada, there are more pleas for action and accountability in sports. In a new open letter, dozens of scholars are joining a chorus of calls for an independent inquiry into the abuse suffered by Canadian athletes. As Catherine Urquhart reports, they're also demanding the federal government act on what they call a system that's enabling the problem.
In 2022, former Team Canada and Whitecaps soccer coach Bob Berarda was convicted of 3 counts of sexually assaulting teenage soccer players and handed a sentence of 2 years less a day. Whistleblower Kira McCormack told a House of Commons committee hearing on abuse in sport that complaints were covered up.
Both the Whitecaps and Canada Soccer covered up Berarda's October 2008 termination, presenting it publicly as a mutual parting of ways, which allowed him to go back and coach teenage girls for another 11 years.
McCormack called for a judicial inquiry. Now joining her, the group Scholars Against Abuse in Canadian Sport. Its 91 members from 30 Canadian and 17 international institutions have sent an open letter to Prime Minister Trudeau demanding an independent judicial inquiry into the widespread reports of sexual, physical, and psychological abuse of athletes throughout the nation's sports system.
There needs to be something that digs deeper and looks more at the preventative side of things.
McIntosh, Ross, and others who signed the letter say they're seeking immediate accountability and meaningful change from Sport Canada and the broader system it governs. This as they push for systemic change in all sports where abuse has been reported, whether it be soccer, hockey, or gymnastics.
We need to just examine the whole thing from start to finish, because in 1989, we did it over steroids. So if we're going to do it over steroids, surely we can do it over child abuse.
Minister of Sport Pascale Saint-Onge has stated her office is taking the issue extremely seriously, noting establishment of Canada's Office of the Sport Integrity Commissioner. But those raising concerns maintain a judicial inquiry is the best way to tackle the problem.
And if we are serious about eradicating abuse, then we have to start treating the sport crisis as a human rights crisis it is, and implement change to make accountability, transparency, integrity, and basic human rights at the heart of our system.
A system that survivors say has enabled predators like Bob Berarda to continue targeting and abusing athletes. Catherine Urquhart, Global News, Vancouver.
Next, the massive ice creations being chiseled to perfection. Canada Post has unveiled its latest stamp today to commemorate Black History Month. It pays tribute to Chloe Cooley, a Black woman who lived in 18th century Upper Canada. Known for her defiance against her captor, Cooley resisted her enslavement however she could. But eventually, she was abducted and sold as a slave to the U.S. Witness accounts of her capture and struggle were used to introduce Canada's first anti-slavery law. The law set the stage for the ending of enslavement in Upper Canada, as well as creating a legal refuge for those fleeing slavery in other countries. A yearly tradition is wrapping up in Atlantic Canada as artists from across the Maritimes took part in an ice sculpting festival in Nova Scotia. Organizers say the event was inspired by an annual winter carnival from decades ago, which featured horse races, ice skating, and more. But it hasn't happened since their winters became warmer. And as Megan King reports, the cool carvings are now an ode to the carnival that once was.
It takes a lot of chipping, brushing, sawing, and melting to shape these ice sculptures, a task 8 carvers from all over the Maritimes are taking on as part of the Downtown Dartmouth Ice Festival.
They come from 3 different disciplines. Some of them are fine arts artists, so they sculpt. Some of them are culinary chefs, so these are the kind of ice sculptures you might see in a banquet. And then we have some chainsaw carvers, which is kind of exciting because they're roaring the chainsaws and the little ice fragments, the snow is flying.
The annual event takes a lot of work and a lot of ice.
We shipped maybe 20 pallets, so you probably have 30,000 pounds of ice here in town.
Chef and carver Richard Chiasson has been using ice sculpting as part of his culinary arts since 1979. And not only does he sculpt ice for this festival, he makes it.
This is the largest ice carving activity in the Atlantic region. And no matter who wants ice carvings in the 3 Atlantic region, it always ends up on my desk because I'm the only producer of ice in the Maritime.
Each square or rectangle here is a block of ice.
Nova Scotia-based artist Claude Roussel spends more than 10 hours on his sculpture after planning with drawings and miniatures.
Carving ice is fun. It's you got a little more forgiveness. Like you can heat it with a torch and you get this nice crystal magical finish. It's brittle, but it doesn't have a grain per se, so it's easier to carve.
For the festival, he's carving the image of a drum dancer, honoring a friend from his time living in Nunavut.
Matthew is a drum dancer, known worldwide, and so I decided to make a drum dancer in respect towards him.
The artist successfully took on the cool commission, finishing more than 40 sculptures. Megan King, Global News, Halifax.
And that is Global National for this Sunday night. I'm Neetu Garcha. Tonight's Your Canada is Banff, Alberta. We love seeing your Canada. Please keep emailing your photos to viewers@globalnational.com. Thanks so much for watching. Donna will be back with you tomorrow. Have a great night.